Welcome back to the CyberVault. Today I'm very excited to be joined by Sounil Yu. Sounil is CTO and Chief AI Officer at Knostic. He's a security innovator and the creator of the Cyber Defense Matrix, which is a framework that's changed how organizations think about security strategy. He's continuing to lead conversations shaping how we defend, detect, and respond in an increasingly complex landscape. Today, we're going to be diving into the origin and the evolution of the cyber defense matrix, the impact it's had across the industry, and how AI is changing its application, and maybe a little bit about what's coming next in cyber defense. But firstly, Sounil, so lovely to have you here with me today. Thank you for joining. Why don't you maybe give us a little bit more of an intro into yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Katie, for having me. So my background is like 30 plus years in security. I cut my teeth in security, doing help desk, which I think a lot of other folks have had the opportunity or struggles to do. Anyway, so having done that for several years, I pivoted into security for about, in a sense, the last 30 years or so. First starting off at Booz Allen as a consultant, helping Booz Allen clients essentially shape up their security program, and then eventually ending up at Bank of America, where I was their chief scientist for several years. It's while I was at Bank of America that I discovered the cyber defense matrix and started to put it to use in interesting ways. Since then, I've served in different capacities in venture capital. I was CISO at a cloud native startup, and then now I am I started my own company called Gnostic to tackle some of the challenges that we're seeing with AI.
Fantastic. And I think you've already set the foundations there, but it is fair to say an absolute expert in what you do. And that's why I'm really excited to dive into this. And I think kind of just for our listeners, because there's a lot of people that are probably really familiar with the cyber defense matrix, but for anybody that isn't already familiar with this, could you maybe tell us a little bit more about what the cyber defense matrix is and the kind of problems that you were trying to solve when you were starting to create it?
Yeah, so actually, let me correct something that you said just a moment ago, which is that I'm an expert in cybersecurity. I think those who've been in cybersecurity for a while recognize that the space of cybersecurity is changing so quickly. It's hard to be an expert in anything, right?
Yes, very
And we're
fair.
really just trying to catch up. And my means for catching up or increasing the speed at which I gain competency is through these mental models. And these mental models really help us shorten the time frame it takes us to go from amateur or beginner to something that's more where we have a greater degree of confidence and actually true competency and confidence in what we understand. And so the cyber defense matrix is really one of those mental models that I've used to gain that competency, if you will. And the reason why this came about was because when I was at Bank of America, as you may imagine, there's a lot of vendors who would wanted to sell into Bank of America. And I would be bombarded with a lot of pitches. And by the way, that was actually my job. So my job was to interact with the startup community. So naturally, I interacted with hundreds of startups on a regular basis. And so but the challenge that I had was just trying to understand what all these different startups do, what problem they're trying to solve. They seem to blend together, seeming to solve all the same problems. Anyway, differentiating that was somewhat challenging. So I needed a mental model, and the mental model that I came up with consists of two dimensions. The first dimension is the NIST cybersecurity framework, the five functions of the NIST cybersecurity framework. So identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. The other dimension is our attack surfaces or the things that we care about. And I group them into five major asset classes: devices, applications, networks, data, and users. So you now have this 5x5 matrix, and that is the cornerstone of what the mental model, the cyber defense matrix mental model is. There is one additional thing that I added at the bottom of the matrix, and it's this changing degree of dependency on people, process, and technology. So on the left side of the matrix, on the functions of identify and protect, we have a greater dependency on technology. On the right side, we have a greater dependence on people. and there's a equal amount of dependency on process throughout all five functions. So that pretty much, hopefully people can visualize what that matrix is, and if you are, then that's the mental model, right? The mental models are things you can hold in your head, and it serves as a rubric to be able to start sifting through the flood of data and information that we get on a regular basis.
No, I think really great breakdown, and you simplify it in a way that I think makes it really digestible. Because you're so correct; it can be really overwhelming with the amount of different startups out there, and even kind of if you're looking at legacy, kind of businesses that and they're continuously bringing out new products and solving new problems. It can be a challenge to keep up with that. And obviously, you built this matrix. You've also written a book that kind of helps break that down. And I suppose that's a really great thing for anybody to have a look into if they want to learn a bit more. But I think kind of to move on to kind of the applications here, because obviously you've created this and now it's actually widely used and adopted by security teams. I mean, just so people can have a bit of an idea, how do organizations use the matrix in real life to kind of improve their security programs?
Sure. So one of the very first use cases is just mapping vendors, and that was the use case I had. Um, just again sorting through all the vendors that you've already purchased to figure out where we have potential overlap, where you can potentially rationalize technologies, or even make cases as to why you should keep certain technologies because it serves a particular function that is underserved or not addressed through some of the other capabilities that you have. Um, now, and that was my initial use case, but along the way, I discovered several other use cases. And in the book, I cite this guy George Box. So George Box, he had this quote, which is, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." And what I've discovered in trying to apply other use cases to the cyber defense matrix is it doesn't really work for everything, and nor should it, right? But for where it has been useful, or where it's useful, it's actually been really useful for different reasons. Um, so I mentioned one of the use cases just mapping vendors, but we've also been able to map other things into the matrix, control requirements, or um, uh, different types of constraints that we have. I use a food analogy, again, another mental model, if you will, but I use a food analogy to describe how you can map different things to the matrix and then see this composite view. So I'll talk about mapping recipes. Think of those as, again, requirements that you have for your program. Allergies, think of those as business constraints. Nutritional needs, think of those as the various threats that we're trying to ward off, like ransomware. Then you of course have the grocery store, which is the vendor ecosystem. Then you have your pantry or whatever you have as your current set of capabilities. Well, you can map all these different things to the cyber defense matrix, and then when you map them all and consolidate them, you get this composite view of what your program looks like and where you are today, where you want to go, and how to get there. And so that roadmap, if you will, described in this particular case as in terms of food, right? What do you have in your pantry? What are the recipes that you need to make? What are the nutritional needs that you're trying to address? What's in your pantry? And ultimately, given that, how do you get there, right? What are the things you need to buy at the grocery store? What are the different constraints that you need to worry about? So those are all the things that we can map to the matrix that helps people use the matrix to develop a roadmap. But all that said, the one thing that I think people have really found useful with the matrix is just the ability to communicate a very complex topic like cybersecurity to a non-technical audience. And when I first built the cyber defense matrix, my natural inclination was, well, gee, I think it might only be useful for large organizations that have a complex cybersecurity program. And I was actually pretty surprised by the fact that I've had a lot of uptake on the matrix by managed service providers and MSPs and MSPs who are catering to much smaller organizations. And the reason why they've really embraced it is because it simplifies the way they communicate what cybersecurity capabilities they're bringing to their clients. And most of these clients have no idea what cybersecurity, how to think about cybersecurity, or what they need. But they've simplified that message into this 5x5 matrix, showing their clients and their customers, here's the suite of capabilities that you currently have today. Here's where you need to be, and here are the services that help you get there. And the matrix has served as a nice communications vehicle to for these smaller organizations that are dealing with, again, non-technical audiences as well.
No, absolutely. And I think, again, you can see, sometimes I think it's just the visibility piece when you can break something down and you can visibly see, okay, these are the differentiators, these are different products. I love the analogy you used there as well, because I think one of the biggest challenges that a lot of people face in security, regardless of their role, is trying to translate it to more business-led individuals or people that just don't necessarily have any background in security or just don't understand it, and it can be a really overwhelming space to kind of be exposed to when you've never really had that exposure before.
One of the things that really helps facilitate communications with different parties is when you have the same mental model. And so the cyber defense matrix being a shared mental model of cybersecurity, we can now communicate, for those who have embraced it, can communicate different things about their program much faster. We have this shared mental model of food. So me relating cybersecurity to food makes it much easier for you to understand. Oh, I understand how you might design a roadmap based on how you figure out what you want to cook tonight. Okay. Um, we have the same problem when it comes to cyber risk quantification. Uh, and then the mental model that most of us rely upon is something associated with money. But I would say that's a misnomer in some respects. I mean, yes, money is something that we can generally relate to. But in some cases, it may be much more relatable if you pick a unit of measure that the business actually cares about a lot. So, for example, at Bank of America, our unit, one of the units of measure that we had was what's called failed customer interactions. Now, there was a dollar value to each failed customer interaction, but they had this mental model of, well, we really want to serve our customers, and so if we have a failed customer interaction, that's a bad thing. And before these, I'm going to make up these numbers just to protect your innocence, so to speak. But let's say the business would freak out if we had 100 failed customer interactions for a given day. Well, we can come in and say, did you realize that this denial of service attack caused 100,000 failed customer interactions? Okay, and all of a sudden the business would be like, what? That's crazy. No, we can't have that happen. Okay, never mind that the failed customer interactions, each one may only cost like a dollar. Okay, um, but so the impact of a failed customer interaction has a much more visceral effect, because it speaks the business's language, and I can
Yeah.
convert that to money, right? But it may not have the same effect as saying we've had 100,000 failed customer interactions, and they would say, how could that possibly be allowable? I mean, that's just so bad, right? So anyway, the point is that there's a shared mental this shared mental model, whether the cyber defense matrix or failed customer interactions or recipes and food, it helps us communicate much more efficiently. And going back to this notion of increasing expertise, by having these shared mental models, we can increase our competency and expertise much faster.
I think that's arguably something that pretty much everybody should really get that exposure to in learning how to translate, because I think that is the biggest challenge. And more often than not, recognizing, okay, how can people truly understand the impact of not having security practices in place or not having the right things in place? Because you're 100% correct. So many people assume it's always down to money, but actually, that's not always the main category or the main thing that businesses measure. Or dependent who you're kind of speaking with, it probably will also change on their role and what are their metrics, what are they personally measured against. So
Mhm.
that approach, that mental model is definitely something that I think is quite versatile, and you can really adapt to the approach no matter who that individual is. So definitely a valuable thing again, whether it's the cyber defense matrix specifically or just kind of adapting that to each and every individual you're kind of approaching within the world of security.
I was going to say that one of the challenges in the current time is AI, of course, has dominated much of our conversations, but I don't know if we have as many shared mental models of how to think about AI. The one mental model that everyone generally relates to is, we anthropomorphize AI itself as being a human. But are there other mental models that can help us understand how to think about some of the challenges that we'll have with AI as well? And so the quicker we can essentially understand those mental models and have shared mental models, we can then be able to accelerate our competency in AI, things like AI as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that kind of touches on to something quite nicely, because actually at the beginning of the podcast we already you kind of delved into this, but security is rapidly evolving. I mean, as that threat landscape evolves and as technology evolves, how do you kind of update and adapt the framework to be able to kind of follow the momentum? Because it's a bit of a chasing your tail game when it comes to the quick evolution of this landscape.
Yeah, so actually, it's a really good mental model allows you to anticipate the future pretty well and to see patterns for what they are. So one of the reasons why I think the cyber defense matrix has served really well in this capacity is that the model itself actually has a predictive nature to it baked in. So let me explain what I mean by that. Um, uh, each of the asset classes, devices, apps, networks, data, users, there's a certain pattern for how we secure each one of them. And the pattern that we follow, it turns out that there's a higher level pattern that we see that if we apply it to each of the different asset classes, we find gaps in our own security program. So let me give you an example. Um, One of the in the function of in the cyber defense matrix, the very first column is what's called the function of identify. And in the function of identify, it involves things like, hey, give me an inventory. Um, so what that means is I would want to have an inventory of my devices. I would want to have an inventory of my applications. I would want to have an inventory of my networks, my data, my users. Okay, so that's the pattern that we should expect. Um, which also means we should ask, well, are we actually having an inventory? Do we have an inventory? Furthermore, the on the bottom of the matrix, I mentioned this degree of dependency on people, process, and technology. On the left side of the matrix, under the function of identify, we should have a significant dependency on technology. So the question is, one, am I inventorying my devices, apps, networks, data, users? But am I also leveraging technology as a predominant function to do so? If the answer is no, I actually have somebody walking around with a clipboard doing an inventory, okay, we got a problem there, right? All right, so now that's one example of seeing these patterns and finding where you have gaps from a people, process, and technology standpoint. But then there's also this aspect of finding gaps in your actual activities as well, because let's say, for example, after you inventory, let's say after you do a data catalog or you inventory your data, usually the next thing that we typically do is we classify our data, okay, or we prioritize our data. But do we actually do the same activity for all these other asset classes? Do we classify our devices? Do we classify our applications? Do we classify our networks? Do we classify our people? And in some cases we do, but in other cases we don't really take a deliberate, concerted effort to do so. So, for example, some people may classify devices into this course a grouping of servers and workstations. But is there a more fine-grained classification of those types of assets? And more so, is there an automated way to do that? And so again, these are things that this pattern matching um, is built into the model itself, and it allows us to anticipate what the future holds. But anyway, that's it. That's just one model. There's other models that we can talk about as well.
Yeah, no, it definitely breaks it down quite nicely though, and I think that's often the challenge in security. Is half of it is the current problems you have, the other half of it is the predictions of, well, what's coming next, because you want to try and stay ahead of the curve as much as you can. And you already kind of briefly touched base on the fact that maybe we don't have any kind of shared mental models of the kind of Gen AI or the implication of AI, and if we actually dive into that a bit more, I mean, How do you see AI impacting the cyber defense matrix? Are we entering like a new category of capability? Are we just automating existing ones? I mean, what's the general impact that you're anticipating?
Yeah, so I naturally tried to fit AI into the cyber defense matrix, only to find that it may not be the right mental model. And in my struggle to figure out where it fit, I first started to think about, okay, well, um, like where does AI manifest in the cyber defense matrix? Is it in the data? Is it in applications? Is it in devices? Or let's consider like when we apply the AI itself, is it displacing the people side of the matrix on the bottom? There's different things that I wrestled through to figure out like how do I understand AI in the context of the cyber defense matrix, and I discovered that well, naturally, going back to my the earlier quote that I mentioned from George Box, all models are wrong, and so I said, okay, is there a better model? And in my attempt to discover a better model, I found an adjacent model, and then it discovered a better model for AI itself. So the adjacent model is if you think about the each of the asset classes in the cyber defense matrix. Let's say, for example, networks. There is another mental model that we have for networks, and it's called the OSI model. And the OSI model has 7 layers. Um, I won't go into each of the layers, but point is that there's 7 layers of the OSI model, and we actually have security controls for some of these layers, not all of them, but the ones that matter for the most part, we have at layer 3, layer 4, and layer 7. And Palo Alto Networks was able to predict that we needed a new layer 7 firewall, and thus was born next generation firewalls. Well, the question I pondered um, is there is there like an OSI model for devices or for applications or for data or for even users? And so I started to explore that. And when I look more closely, I did find an OSI like model for data. And that model is called the DIKW pyramid. So that stands for data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. So you can think of it in the same way as the OSI model. You have these different layers. And what I discovered is we have all these controls for data, usually at the like permission level type of stuff or encryption or whatever else it is. We have controls at the information level, which is usually like sensitivity labels, data classification kind of stuff. But what does it mean to have controls at the knowledge layer? Well, guess what? AI has introduced knowledge tools to knowledge workers. We are squarely in the knowledge age. AI has really introduced knowledge-based systems into our ecosystem. So now the question is, what are the controls, or what are some of the challenges or problems that we're going to even see in this space? And one of the ones that I was able to anticipate early on was, okay, we're going to have a knowledge security problem. And the knowledge security problem in this case is one where you start oversharing all this content. And we've kind of seen this in other capacities when people first rolled out Google search appliance, and all of a sudden it overshared because all these files were easily discoverable. And we generally fixed that problem. But now we have a new problem with these knowledge-based systems that can infer sensitive things as well. And so we have to find a way to lock that down. And so it's a new type of it's a new layer. And what we've also learned in the history of these security controls is if I have a layer 7 problem on the network, layer 3 and 4 controls simply won't work. So if I have a knowledge centric problem, data and information centric controls won't work. And so we need to now figure out what are those knowledge centric controls. And that's essentially why I started Gnostic as a company. I'm like, okay, we need to figure out what these knowledge centric controls are, and let's go about building those out.
I think that's such a great breakdown and such a I think it's like we say, because it's quite rapidly evolving, and this technology is, that's the entire point of specifically things like Gen AI is the fact that, it's something that's continuously improving. We're getting more and more from it. But obviously then being able to keep up with that is a bit of a different story. And again, it's that, how do we try and stay ahead of the curve? And I think often it's that innovation piece, and just really having to spend the time and say, okay, right, we've recognized where we're going to need to look at investing and look at kind of solving these issues. But it's it's not going to happen overnight. It's we've got to educate ourselves in what this impact truly looks like. But I think what would be really valuable to close off, because this has been packed with some really valuable information, and definitely some key takeaways. And like we said, for anybody that wants to kind of dive in a bit more detail, you've absolutely got the book and everything for people to look into. But for security leaders that may be listening today, what's the most immediate way that they can use the matrix to either reframe their current security program, or just kind of start making some positive changes that could have a pretty quick impact into the current practices that they've got in place?
Yeah, the easiest way is really to map your controls and your technologies into the matrix. That's been the number one use case. But I think you'll also find those who go through that exercise will find that mapping is actually extremely hard. And the exercise itself is worthwhile because it really refines our understanding of some of the words that we use. For example, what's the difference between the word identify and detect? I mean, they're kind of synonymous, okay? But one of the things I talk about in the book is that there's a very clear distinction between those two functions. And if we confuse which ones we're doing, then it affects how we allocate resources. And so it's important that we recognize, are we dealing with a function that happens before what I call boom, or something that happens after boom, okay? And that's like one example of just a way that I differentiate the different types of activities that we do. But anyway, the quickest takeaway is just go take your technologies or your controls, start mapping them to the matrix. You'll learn a lot just through that process. But you'll also see how you can communicate the gaps that you have in your program and your strategies just using the matrix itself.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining me here today, Sounil. This has been extremely valuable. And like I say to anybody that's tuned in, make sure to have a look at the book, kind of definitely take some research into the cyber defense matrix. I think it's extremely valuable. And once you have a look into it, and if you haven't already figured out from this episode, you'll probably see why it's been so widely adopted by so many different security teams. But again, thank you so much. And to our listeners, as always, don't forget to subscribe. Make sure to share this episode with your security peers. Make sure to obviously get connected with Sounil and follow along with what the team at Gnostic are doing. But that's it for us today. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time for more conversations shaping cyber.